What do you think that you've seen with the work that you've done it's going to take to bring many of these various groups and very good intentioned advocates together to make a difference in Jacksonville?
Doesn't change occur one person at a time,
Definitely.
interacting with one person at a time. And sometimes it's just the smallest things that promote inclusiveness and an appreciation for differences.
An asset we have is intergenerational. When we think about inclusiveness and diversity, it tends to become a discussion around race or faith, and what's overlooked sometimes is intergenerational issues. And I learn a lot from our young people. They think differently. They think more inclusively. And the more that I'm coming more and more to this conviction, the more that we can embrace the values and respect what young people are saying. They don't see the world through the same lenses that we do, and they see it in a much more inclusive way, quite naturally.
I've been in Jacksonville since I was 7 years old, and I've seen many changes here. And being first generation American, because my parents were from Europe, I had a little different background, a little different growing up. And I went through the years of my mother not knowing about whether her family, any of them, survived the Holocaust, and they didn't. But I grew up with that constantly, and I saw them bring people over here, and that stayed with me. And I also grew up in a neighborhood where being Jewish was not okay, and had pins put into me to see about if I had blood or not. And when I started hearing these things about GLBT issues, gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender issues, and knew that concerned my children too, and a lot of people I love in this city, I was devastated.
It's encouraging sometimes when you see the kids, young people, they, instead of where it says race, and they check other human. And I love it. I mean, I just love seeing that.
You alluded to, I think, maybe a touch point in your life, Rita, that kind of set you on your way. And I'm sure there are other touch points that you could talk about where you had this realization, here's how I'm going to be able to make a difference.
I feel as a hospice nurse and as a nurse at the Free Medical Clinic, Volunteers in Medicine, I feel that sometimes it's overwhelming to think, how can I really make a big difference? All I can do are the small things. And you try and just show by example. I mean, I'm only one person, but I can make a difference. And when you lose that, if you're one person, you don't think you can make a difference, but you do make a difference. And you make a difference in their lives, their family lives, and it's kind of like the pebble that you throw in the water. And it just kind of spreads out, and you just see that, you know, and it's contagious. Right.
For me, it started with a phone call from a friend, Tom Serwatka, who I'd known for years, respected for years as a friend, had worked together at UNF, and of course knew he was gay. And he asked me if the business community and if I personally would get out in front of this issue, and it was easy. I said, well, of course, Tom. And he was very emotional about it. I said, well, why is this so surprising to you? And he said, well, I just never knew. And I realized then that despite years of friendship and getting to know each other, we hadn't really known each other because we hadn't crossed that level of communication where he was completely certain how I felt about him as a person because of his sexuality. And until the question was broached, the answer wasn't known. And it was an epiphany for me. And I realized that, I mean, I knew my own mental construct and what I thought, but it was clear that I hadn't exhibited that very authentically or honestly, even to good friends like Tom. And so my conclusion was I simply had to be more vocal, more public, more real about this, just to really be more human.
In my family, being African American, my family was involved in the civil rights movement for equality of people of color. And for me, as I hear people talk about groups, I always insert African American. So whatever it is, and it hits home for me. if you can discriminate against gay and lesbian, well, what if you put African Americans in that sentence? I don't want anyone to exclude anyone from the table, because we all belong at the table. And so when I'm standing up for someone else, I'm actually standing up for my children and my grandchildren.
You know, I do testing and counseling in the jails every weekend, and I meet a lot of different people, of course, but they're human beings, they're people. And you just have to look at each individual and regard them as a person, you know, not in judgment, but just as a person. Otherwise, you can't do any of this.
I think that's a really important point, Frida. Silence is acquiescence.
Yes,
Yes.
If you
absolutely.
see something and just walk by,
Yes.
you're complicit.
Yeah.
That's a
Yeah.
hard thing to realize because we've all done it at
Oh, yeah.
different times.
Oh,
And
It's
you
hard
have
to make
stop
the
yourself
stop.
and say, this is
Right.
not acceptable, and to call it out.
It was sort of interesting having been one of the founders in hospice here. But when we were getting ready to build the Hadlow Center, the board had this decision what we were going to do. And they were absolutely determined that we were going to segregate all the AIDS patients. That's the way it was. So I was director then, and so I said, well, could we have a decision here if I go out and take care of AIDS patients and see what their care is and so forth, and which I did in the inner city here, and then if I come back and give you my decision, would you be willing to hear that? Because the board was pretty divided, about half and half. There was going to be segregation, a special wing, and closed off, and this and everything. So I did go out. I went out. I took care of 4 AIDS patients, and 2 of them had died. I work with the families. I work with everything. Anyway, of course, my conclusion was when I went back, everyone in this hospice will be treated exactly the same. There won't be any different procedures for anyone. No one will be segregated. And they bought that.
That's wonderful.
And so it was very successful. And I was really proud, that I was able to do that.
The height of the epidemic, there were a group of us that would always go to the hospitals because the nurses wouldn't give them the trays, and everything was left outside the door. And we would go in and bring the trays to them and talk to them and everything, because it was like just a segregated group of people. Because people didn't understand, and they didn't want to understand.
You may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one.
I'm kind of tracking some discussion here that a lot of people have done some discriminatory behavior because there's a lot of fear involved here. You possibly also have had that emotion as you've begun to do this work, and you talk about how to overcome that and help others. Because there's a fear to step out, and fear of people that they don't know or have never interacted with, special needs kids or persons with disabilities. When I got here, I had 5 white managers working for me, and they said they'd never reported to an African American before, that they've been managers for 17 years.
sometimes if we can just get people who are different together to just have dialogue. I think of study circles, and I can remember, and this is a personal experience, not understanding the big hoopla over, the Braves and Native Americans being offended by certain things. And I mean, I was a full-fledged adult at that point. And I remember being in study circles for the first time, and there was one individual there who was a Native American, and he helped me understand. And, without having had that interaction with him, I probably still wouldn't understand. But it became clear to me, and because of that, I could say, to other people, you're saying nobody's hurt by that, but let me help you understand something. So I think it's kind of like each one teach one, each one reach one, that individually we can do way more than we think we can do, just by helping people to understand the bigotry and that fear is based on lack of knowledge, lack of understanding.
The fact is, at least I believe the fact is, everybody experiences fear. And Madeline's right, it's usually based on a lack of knowledge or understanding. And if you can make it okay to talk about that, you can get past it. But everybody has prejudices, so confront them, acknowledge that it's real and it's human, and then work your way past that. But you can't solve a problem until you can articulate it.
So no matter how much we're doing, volunteer or work or anything, you'll always see other things that need attention. There is always a next. There is something else that you want to do, that you want to try and fix, that you want to try and make better. And that's the way life is.
I hear you all holding yourselves accountable to make a difference. That's one of the guiding principles of OneJax also, is accountability when doing this work. How would you kind of explain that to others to get them involved in being accountable? Because as you said, there's so many things to choose from.
If they would just realize that they can do a small thing, they don't have to do a large thing. If they help one person, they've already accomplished something. If they have a neighbor who needs help, that's a great thing to do. And there are so many people that do need help in so many places.
I think we have to form more situations where we're getting people into groups that are different. I think we have to be intentional about this,
That's
especially with young people, with kids when they're so formative.
From a community standpoint, the more ways that we can, as leaders in the community, can structurally figure out how to cause those interactions to happen, the more that kind of respect will build. When we went, and I'm informed by this human rights ordinance issue, because it was recent and it was public and it was emotional.
It's very emotional.
On all sides, and I remember watching, the people that were opposed to this did so with such passion, and you could tell it was in their hearts. They really, really opposed this, and something had stirred something very primal and basic in them, and you have to respect that there's something at work there. And the proponents were equally passionate, and I had some people say, "Why did you do that?" Because it was so divisive, it was so polarizing, and it was, on one level. On another level, and maybe it's because I'm a natural optimist, it was unifying. And one of the we're at UNF, and this is where we're kind of meeting with a group of the supporters, maybe 15 or so supporters, and I looked around that table, and this had all come together on an issue. There was no pre-planning or anything, and I looked around and said, you could not define a group on that. There were white people, there were black people, there were old people, there were young people, there were rich people, there were unemployed people, there were heterosexuals and homosexuals, and there was no demarcation, but they came together around something that was important. I said, there's real power here. There's something that was unifying and humanizing just by having this conversation, having this debate, and the issue itself made everybody that participated more fully human.
And it was OneJax, wasn't it, that brought together the group to have an open discussion around prayer?
Right, the civil discourse.
Right. And I think we can have more situations like that where we are intentional and we do bring people together who have differences, not to try and persuade one side to join the other side, but just to have conversation and not fight, but to have conversation. And that's the difference, I think.
Yeah, let me correct myself, because actually it was around civility.
Right.
I said civil discourse because, as we know, at times just like that, we have to have this type of discussion, and we know there will be discourse, but to come together around civility around this issue.
Right.
So where are we seeing that happen, and then how can we have it to happen more often here in this city?
Without dialogue, we can't get anywhere.
No.
We have to be able to speak to people and realize that we may not have the same feelings about things, but we've got to have dialogue with one another. And we need to put it up front that we realize that we may not agree, but we want to be heard, and we want to hear what they have to say.
You know, Preeti, you said something a moment ago, I think, is that the start of this conversation is that the moderates don't talk. But what charge would you give?
Well, one of the things that always comes to mind here is the lack of participation in our voting. I think that people need to vote. And how do you get people? I don't care who they vote for, but it's our privilege, you know, and such an honor in this country to be able to vote for whomever you want, really. And I think that's really, really important.
People that are privileged to be in positions of leadership, whether it's political leadership or business leadership, religious leaders, need to accept the responsibilities of leadership. And that means to speak honestly, courageously about these topics, because they have influence over people. They have people that are part of their communities or work for them, and it makes a difference. And it's easy to say, well, that's not my job. Well, it is your job. The community is your community. It's our home, and we have a moral obligation to use the authority and privilege of leadership, and it is a privilege, to make the community better. If you don't do that, you can't really say you're a very good leader.
I'd like for people just to find their passion and to go after it.
And we may have to teach people what passion is, because I think a lot of people have forgotten what passion is. They've truly forgotten that it's okay to be passionate about something, because they've been put into little boxes, and they have forgotten that, passion guides my life. And I think it guides everyone's life that's sitting at this table. And so without passion, you can't do anything. You can't accomplish anything.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed this. I hope you have
Thank
too.
you. We have enjoyed it.
Thank you very much.
I hope someday you'll join